This can only end in despotism. That was Benjamin Franklin's chilling prediction on September 17th, 1787. The founders understood what would lead to tyranny, and they warned us about it over and over and over. So how did the former land of the free become home to the largest government in history? Today on this episode, I'll share with you 5 key warnings from the founders that explain how we got here. And understanding them is absolutely essential if we're ever going to turn things around for good. But first of all, before getting to that, welcome. And thank you for joining me here on the Path to Liberty. My name is Michael Bolden with the 10th Amendment Center, and this is the show for Friday, February 21st, 2025. Let's get right to it with, warning number 1. Too much toleration. Freedom is not lost all at once. The founders repeatedly warned us that tolerating even small violations of our liberty of the Constitution, usurpations of power, opens the door to total tyranny. It creates a precedent that leads to a slow creep that speeds up over time and eventually turns liberty into nothing more than a distant memory. Thomas Jefferson put it like this in response to Alexander Hamilton's National Bank in 1791. He said, "To take a single step beyond the boundaries thus specially drawn around the powers of Congress is to take possession of a boundless field of power no longer susceptible of any definition." He was just reiterating principles that were widely understood throughout the American Revolution. Here, for example, James Otis Jr. in 1767 said a free government never degenerated into tyranny all at once. It is the work of years. They all understood that small steps were the way that they built precedent and expanded power over time. And eventually it turned into a deadly disease. And that's how John Adams described it back when he was one of the good guys, writing as Novanglis in 1775. He said, "The nature of the encroachment upon the American Constitution is such as to grow every day more and more encroaching. Like a cancer, it eats faster and faster every hour." I think his quote here is really a great answer to, what happened? How did things get like this? Well, it didn't get like this from last year or yesterday or a month ago or 10 years ago. This has been building for a long time, and it gets worse and worse, faster and faster over time. And listen to how he explains how this plays out. He said, "The revenue creates pensioners, and the pensioners urge for more revenue. The people grow less steady, spirited, and virtuous. The seekers more numerous and more corrupt, until and every day increases the circle of their dependence and expectance, until virtue, integrity, public spirit, simplicity, frugality become the objects of ridicule and scorn, and vanity, luxury, foppery, selfishness, meanness, and downright venality swallow up the whole society." It's almost like he's living with us today in describing what we've been living under, for a long, long time, and getting worse and worse and worse. He really nailed it. And John Dickinson, the penman of the American Revolution, writing in Letters from a Farmer in Pennsylvania, the most widely read documents on American liberty until publication of Thomas Paine's Common Sense in 1776, pointed out that he was most concerned about small attacks on our liberty, small usurpations of power, because of the precedent that it creates. Anytime they do that, someone in the system is licking their chops and saying, "Oh, I know how I can use that." He said, and he was responding to the Townsend Acts. He said, "Some persons may think this act of no consequence because the duties are so small. A fatal error. Again, like a deadly disease. That," he said, "is the very circumstance most alarming to me. For I am convinced that the authors of this law would never have obtained an act to raise so trifling a sum as it must do, had they not intended by it to establish a precedent for future use. Government always builds upon the power that's left to them. And unless you get rid of the power structures that shouldn't be there, someone else is going to come along and build upon it once again. He said, to console ourselves with the smallness of the duties is to walk deliberately into the snare that is set for us, praising the neatness of the workmanship. In other words, it's a trap. And really, from Jefferson to Adams and pretty much everyone in between, the founders saw toleration for usurpations of power as the first crack in the foundation of freedom, and eventually it would open the floodgates. And that leads me to point number 2, warning number 2, too much ignorance. The tyrant's best friend is ignorance. Liberty and ignorance cannot coexist. And that's how Samuel Adams, he pointed out that it is this is him writing as Valerius Poplicola in the Boston Gazette. This is the publication of the Sons of Liberty. I think it was 1772. All these will be linked to, the source documents will be linked to in the show notes over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path-to-liberty. Alan Mosley will get that organized, and I will get it published a couple of hours after this live stream is done. But back to Samuel Adams, he said, it is in the interest of tyrants to reduce the people to ignorance and vice. Well, if the people are unaware of the rules for government, of what their rights are, well, they're not going to be very likely to stand up to usurpations of power and put a stop to them. They all understood this. They all understood it. But so many people today are just fine with being spoon-fed education, I guess we could call it, about the Constitution from government-run schools. This is so dangerous. Anyways, here's how Benjamin Rush put it. Freedom can only exist in the society of knowledge. Without learning, men are incapable of knowing their rights. And Thomas Jefferson had a very similar take in a letter to Charles Yancey. He said, if a nation expects to be ignorant and free in a state of civilization, it expects what never was and never will be. Samuel Adams, Benjamin Rush, Thomas Jefferson, and so many others all agreed that an uneducated people will never be a free people. They'll never stay free, become free, anything. And that leads me to number 3, too much trust. Trusting people with power to do the right thing with power is a recipe for disaster. And all the founders understood this, but the anti-federalist side, I think, was far better, far more vocal about this, and warned about it far more often. Here are a few examples from people that maybe you've never been taught about. For example, Dr. Samuel Willard in the Massachusetts Ratifying Convention said, where power had been trusted to men, whether in great or small bodies, they had always abused it. Not sometimes, not once in a while, not here and there, not just over there, not most of the time, but always. And when you understand that they always abuse power, whether in the short term or the long term, you start thinking about how much power they have far differently. And that's why old Abraham White, one of my favorite anti-federalists, not super vocal, but here he is also in the Massachusetts Ratifying Convention, said, I wouldn't trust a flock of Moseses. Patrick Henry, in one of his many great and very long speeches in the summer of 1788 in Virginia, said, show me that age and country where the rights and liberties of the people were placed on the sole chance of their rulers being good men without a consequent loss of liberty. Now, maybe some of those rulers are good men and they do the right thing in the short run. That's not freedom. That's just luck, because eventually they're not going to be there and someone else is going to take that same power and they're going to run with it and use it in really nasty ways. And Patrick Henry, like so many others at the founding time of the founding, the old revolutionaries, they were students of history. Unlike most of us today, they understood that if you give people power, someone is going to use that power. And it's not always going to be someone you like. And it's not always going to be someone who wants to use that power in ways that you like. And he continued with this. He thought it was insanity to trust people with too much power. He said, I say that the loss of that dearest privilege has ever followed with absolute certainty every such mad attempt. Now, here from George Washington in his farewell address, we're actually tying together these first 3 because sometimes people turn a blind eye to constitutional violations because they're ignorant. They don't know what they are. They don't know the limits of the Constitution. Sometimes they do it because they trust that the rulers won't abuse them, or they don't think long term and they don't think about how they're ignorant of the fact that someone else will have that same power. And so they're trusting people to do the right thing with usurpations of power. But George Washington warned that this is actually a weapon that destroys freedom. And in his farewell address, he first points out that, well, if you don't like the limits of the Constitution, the way to deal with that is not to have them just do what you like anyway. There's an amendment process. He said, if, in the opinion of the people, the distribution or modification of the constitutional powers be in any particular wrong, let it be corrected by an amendment in the way which the Constitution designates. But, he said, let there be no change by usurpation. For though this, in one instance, may be the instrument of good, it is the customary weapon by which free governments are destroyed. The precedent, as soon as you establish this precedent that they can usurp power because you like it, he said, must always greatly overbalance in permanent evil any partial or transient benefit which the use can at any time yield. I don't think I need to reiterate much, if anything, on that one. Of course, Washington's farewell, along with everything else, will be linked to in the show notes. I encourage you to read it in full, in context, on your own time. But that brings me to point number 4. Too much obedience. Compliance does not preserve freedom. It actually destroys it. When people submit to usurpations of power, to unlawful acts of government, they in essence are forging their own chains. And that's how John Dickinson put it. But first, let's go to James Otis Jr., 1762, I believe. He said, so long as people will submit to arbitrary measures, so long will they find masters. And here's Dickinson in his amazing pamphlet, his broadside urging noncompliance with the Stamp Act in late 1765. He pointed out that, look, you can't even comply with this thing because as soon as you do, you're giving them a precedent to do more and more and more. He said, if you comply with the act by using stamped papers, you fix, you rivet perpetual chains upon your unhappy country. You unnecessarily, voluntarily establish the detestable precedent which those who have forged your fetters ardently wish for to varnish the future exercise of this new claimed authority. So they didn't have the authority to do it. He's making the case. And if you comply with it, you're giving them the opportunity to do more and more of the same. So you absolutely have to disobey them if you want to keep things in check. And so we continue with this. If you quietly bend your necks to that yoke, you prove yourselves ready to receive any bondage to which your lords and masters shall please to subject you. Now, most people don't like being talked to like that, but this is how the founding generation, the old revolutionaries, discussed precedents, well, that were disgusting. Precedents that our government is not authorized to create. And that's why you can't quietly bend your necks to that yoke because, well, you'll get more and more of the same. Now, the founders brought this same mentality forward. I don't actually have an image for it here, but they brought this mentality forward to the Constitution and how to enforce it. They considered, as James Madison put it, a refusal to cooperate with officers of the Union as the essential enforcement mechanism in the Constitution. And I covered that in much more detail just this month in actually our most viewed episode ever, How to Enforce the Constitution, whether the government likes it or not. I encourage you to check that one out or check it out again if you already have, because ultimately you cannot comply your way out from under the largest government in history, period. And that brings me to point number 5. Too much fear. Fear is government's greatest weapon. Politicians and people with power and supporters of those people in power, they exploit real or imagined fear all the time to expand their power and attack our liberty. This destroys liberty in the long run. John Adams, again, back when he was one of the good guys in 1776, pointed out that fear is the foundation of most governments. Now, of course, I just removed the word most, but it was pretty spot on this one. Fear is the foundation. When people are afraid, they run to government to protect them, whatever it may be. And it can be domestic fears, and it could be foreign ones, as James Madison put it. Here in a letter to Thomas Jefferson in the run-up to Adams signing the Alien and Sedition Acts of 1798, he said, "Perhaps it is a universal truth that the loss of liberty at home is to be charged to provisions against danger, real or pretended, from abroad." I mean, this is not your run-of-the-mill tinfoil hat conspiracy guy here. This is James Madison telling us that governments will use fake, pretended danger in order to grow their power and attack your liberty. And ultimately, fear is what prevents us from living in a real land of the free, if we are to believe Thomas Paine, who said the strength and powers of despotism consist wholly in the fear of resisting it. So really the question again, how did the land of the free become the home to the largest government in history? We've got 5 key points. The founders saw it coming. First of all, too much toleration of small usurpations of power opens the door to limitless power. That's what Thomas Jefferson told us. Too much ignorance of the Constitution, too much ignorance of the principles of liberty. It leaves us open, well, it leaves us basically as easy prey, I guess we could put it. Too much trust in politicians, in rulers, people with power, experts. It breeds abuse and corruption, and we are surrounded by abuse and corruption 24/7, 365. Number 4, too much obedience. We forge our own chains around our unhappy country, as Dickinson put it. And too much fear silences us and keeps us, well, inactive. It keeps us compliant as their power grows unchecked. Tying it all together, I think James Otis Jr. really summed it up best. He said, "There is nothing that will destroy liberty more than a prevailing opinion that it is better tamely to submit than nobly assert and vindicate our privileges." Now, just because people have done the wrong thing, really, for generations, doesn't mean it's game over. And I think St. George Tucker, in his view of the Constitution of the United States, put it best when he said, "The acquiescence of the people of a state under any usurped authority for any length of time can never deprive them of the right of resuming the sovereign power into their own hands whenever they think fit or are able to do so, since that right is perfectly unalienable." I think we can close it out with a little inspiration, maybe some motivation from John Hancock in his great Massacre Day oration in 1774. He said, "Surely you never will tamely suffer this country to be a den of thieves. Remember, my friends, from who you sprang." I don't think it's any surprise that we learn about none of this stuff in government-run schools, and that's part of why we work so hard here at the TAC every single day to reach and teach more and more people about these essential foundational principles from the founders and the old revolutionaries, and nothing helps us do that work more than the financial faith and support of our members. If you want to help us continue this and expand our work and expand our reach, join us for as little as $2 a month over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. It's all spelled out. Couple of bucks of that dirty government fiat, we make it go a long, long way here at the TAC. We also have annual, 5-year, and lifetime options. Or if you prefer a one-time gift to pitch in, that's 10thamendmentcenter.com/donate. No pressure on any of it, but I'd be extremely grateful for any consideration you can give to putting your financial faith behind our work today. You can also take a number of free and easy peasy actions to help us spread the word, primarily by triggering the algorithms of the mainstream platforms you may watch or listen on. Like a lot of watch time percentage, the higher percentage it is on YouTube or any other video platforms, even beyond 100%, certainly helps out a lot. Reviews on Apple Podcasts or any other podcast platform, hitting the like button, subscribe, get notifications, comments in the archive, sharing links, etc., etc. I'm extremely grateful for any way you can help us spread the word. I really appreciate you being here. I hope you enjoyed this episode. I hope it made you think, and I hope you learned something. That's more important than anything. I hope you have an awesome weekend, and I look forward to seeing you next week here on the Path to Liberty.